So our topic today is twofold. I'm going to be talking about how to implement a successful interactive planning session and also transitioning the information we get out of that back into P6. So quick introduction, here's our agenda. We're going to talk about introduction to our topic today, provide some project background so that we're going to be providing some examples of the process we've been going through and how it relates to this effort. Talk about setting up a successful interactive planning session. What do you need to do that, and who do you need at the table? Finally, wrap up with the transition from NetPoint to P6 and vice versa. So all this great information that you're going to be capturing in NetPoint, what do you do with it if P6 is your schedule of record? My name is Dennis. I am a civil engineer by education. Found myself at PMA 18 years ago. And have last 18 years I've been working on planning and scheduling work, also on contracts and time impact analysis and delay analysis. In our recent effort, we've been working, PMA's been providing project management, project control services for a biopharma project located both in Massachusetts and in China. It's a rather significant effort. The program budget, total project budget, is $600 million. And that's broken between, again, a project in Massachusetts and in China. PMA is currently working for the owner, helping them represent their project controls needs, working with the designer and the CM, both in China and in Massachusetts, to help define a detailed project schedule. Okay, so our objectives today. Our objectives are, again, get some insight into an interactive planning session. How do you set up a good IPS? We've been doing this now for approximately a year for this client, and we've picked up some great learned lessons, and we hope to share those with you. We're going to talk about the benefits of NetPoint and how that supports a good IPS, how we're using IPSs to build upon our scheduled development. We're doing mostly IPSs for level 4 and level 5, helping taking our P6, which is at a higher level, down and kind of feeding the detail back into P6. Point 5 here, when do we utilize NetPoints versus Primavera? Talking about the transition between those two, and then how we envision IPSs will feed our scheduled development process through the life of this job. Okay, so talked about some of these things, but just a few more items about our program. One budget, 2 different funding sources, a real estate funding source and a lab diagnostics funding source. So the cost components of this are quite interesting. We're dealing with cultural differences, we're dealing with time zone differences. It's really a wonderful and exciting project, but it does raise some concerns that the schedule is helping us overcome. So this project is a new endeavor for the client in China, and we're leveraging a smart team of subject matter experts and core teams that are based out of the United States. So PMA's current involvement is boots on the ground in the United States and helping to feed information through our core team and SMEs that are US-based about the China project as well. And then finally, we have a lot, this is a new effort in China. So there's new technology transfers, there's regulatory issues, there's different methods and processes that are happening over there. And again, using IPS to solve all those problems. Working with quite a bit of constraints. We're going to focus in, some of these examples are going to be on the United States, Massachusetts site. We have an existing project, an existing campus that is functioning at or near capacity. There's in the range of 1,000 employees there, 6 buildings. Those 6 buildings are about at capacity in terms of office space, lab space, parking spaces. And now we want to come in and add $300 million of total project cost to a facility that is already kind of busting at the seams. So schedule is a huge driver for this. We're dealing with construction logistics. We're dealing with time and resource logistics, and certainly, as always with every job, cost constraints. As you can imagine, with any type of biopharma job, it's driven by getting product to market. And right now, they are functioning at meeting the current market demands, but they see that demand going up between worldwide need, US need, China need, and we have a planned interim milestones of getting capacity increased by 10% by this year, 30% by 2 years out, and 80% by a couple years out. The overall goal is to double capacity. Our Massachusetts-based project is 1 campus, 6 buildings, and of that, we think we've broken it down into about 50 subcomponents. And this was a tool that we used NetPoint for that we hadn't really seen done before. This is a logic interdependency graphic that is time and duration independent. And the reason we developed this is because there are so many different sub-projects that are happening within the whole that we needed to figure out the interdependencies between the two. And you could ask one person, and that one person would say, oh, this has to happen, A has to happen before C, and then a second person would say it's the other way around. So we need to document that change. And having it in a written narrative was confusing and it wasn't clear, and we ended up coming up with something like this. We're using yellow lines, the solid lines, to indicate a driving relationship. And here we're using the gray lines to indicate a relationship that is not currently driving in our plan. So the timeline, which isn't shown here, is approximately 3 to 3.5 years. This is our go-to tool. When someone comes up and says, why can't we do project 2.16 tomorrow? Well, building 2 isn't going to be ready for project 1.6 because we need to do projects X, projects Y, and that can't start until XYZ, driven by long leads or driven by design. So what we've done is we've taken this tool, right, and this helps us set priorities for how we're going to start diving deeper into our scheduled development process. So all the items on the left have varying float values. You can see that 4.13, 4.14 don't have a lot after them. So how are we doing scheduled development? We're using IPS sessions. We're doing this to get greater detail into the design, into the scope of the work, to fully understand the scope. We've been involved for a year, and during that year, one of our main goals was to get full funding. So our design was at a conceptual level, yet we had to commit to a construction time frame, a delivery time frame, and a cost. So what we've done is held in contingency and developed an overall level 1, level 2 schedule, and now we're coming back and filling in the voids to make sure our detailed plan is going to support the requirements. So what other benefits are we getting out of IPSs? We're using a lot of detailed work plans that we'll talk about later, and really the last 2 bullets, left and right here, are about getting the teams in alignment. You know, we're finding that people come from different backgrounds in this project. You've got the process engineer, you've got the facilities guy, you've got people from validation or quality, and each of them have different expectations about the project. We're using these sessions to align these expectations and get buy-in and support to a schedule so we can all drive to that schedule. Why are we using NetPoint versus P6? We have found, and I think you guys would probably say the same, thanks to the graphical interface and the use of plan dates, planning sessions really can get the buy-in and support from your audience when they feel like they're part of the process. It encourages the hand-on interaction, get people up there, touching the screen, moving things around. The use of plan dates makes it feel like their own versus an early start date. I know I'm not going to start that for 3 months. Why does that scheduler keep telling me my early date is next week? I'm not going to do it next week. Gotcha. All right. When they feel like it's part of their plan, they're part of the team. They buy in and they support it. The whole F9 item, you know, the immediate impact. And then finally, we've found a lot of benefit in work stream planning. So using the linear spatial aspects of it, you can take work streams, define their work streams, and then see how the work streams align, right? You can get that vertical alignment. So what are the 3 sub-areas? What are we working towards here that we find the biggest benefit for? So design development, pull planning, and process development. So our design development right now, obviously the designer wants to give as few of the design packages as possible. It's more efficient for them, it's more cost effective. They don't need to be putting their pencils down all the time to issue design packages. However, if you recall our interdependencies graphic, that doesn't support the construction time frame. We need some packages tomorrow, and we may not need other ones for 2 years out. We don't know that initially, 6 months ago. We didn't know what those were because we didn't have a defined schedule. So what we're doing is working through, going from level 1 down to level 2 to level 3, and then using NetPoint to finalize that decision about our required on-job dates and when do we need to do procurement. Therefore, we need our design packages when. Pull plan discussions. We're kind of using pull plan and work plan here independently. We use a pull plan session to help the project managers on this team figure out what they need to do. The project managers on most jobs are stretched very thin. Some of them still have their day jobs in addition to this mega expansion, and they are responsible to have the site ready for construction. They need to have people cleared. They need to have equipment ready. They need to have product capacity built up so we can take the facility down and there's not an impact to inventory. They're stretched thin, and they don't have that ability to get that information for themselves, so we help them develop it in a pull plan. And then finally, process development. We mentioned earlier that this is this has a whole bunch of new components in terms of equipment scale-up. Our initial design, our existing facility has a 1,000-gallon tank. We're going to move up to a 5,000-gallon. Has a different process, has different validation requirements. All those things need to be thought out. The next thing is to talk about our goals. How are we going to define our goals for each meeting? No, what are we going to talk about? What are the priorities? Being very clear in the topic for each agenda, issuing a clear agenda to the team, getting the right SMEs and stakeholders, authorized stakeholders at those meetings. You want to make sure you have the right people represented all the time. Know the goal of your meeting and make sure you're achieving in that time, because time is probably the most precious resource we have on this project and any others. And if you're using up time at a meeting that's not getting you to your goal, you're going to start losing support for your process. And also what we found is by setting nice, clear goals, you build a sense of accomplishment and you continue to build buy-in. You know, if you have the 5 smartest people at the project in your meeting and it's a successful hour and they feel like they've accomplished something, they're going to want to come back to your meeting next week. So what we've tried to do is start with small incremental wins and build upon those. So preparation for the meeting is just as important. As I said, the core team that we have is pulled between a week in Massachusetts, a week in China, a week down at the designer's office in Philadelphia, and then they need a week to recover and go to Florida and take a nap. So our access to them is limited. We need to have our stuff in order. That means we need to have our documentation in place and our drawings in place and our nomenclature. We can't be vetting that stuff out when you've got the 10 smartest people in the room and they're waiting you to find a nice drawing to talk about. So those are the first 3 bullets there. Prepare the schedule. We do our best to try to align what the NetPoint file is going to look like before we get in the meeting. We build Fragnets and we put them off the side. We'll talk about that in another second here. And then finally, the last 2 are important for the people you're going to be dealing with on a regular basis. If you're going to have a team of 10 people and they're going to be involved in IPS sessions for the next year or 2, take 20 minutes and talk them through the process. You know, this is why we're doing it. You guys are a valuable member of the team. You're the smartest folks that we need this information from, and this is going to be a repetitive thing, and I want you to understand why we're doing it. So let's talk about the preparation of the schedule. So what we found is understanding and taking your NetPoint file to the right level of detail for the audience. If you eventually need a level 5 schedule, but your audience isn't the right audience to bring you there, maybe they just can get you to level 3 or 4, great. Start there, and then you do subgroup meetings afterwards. As noted, we try to build Fragnets offline. So take your NetPoint canvas, off to the side of it, build the type of Fragnet that you want to talk to. So if we're talking about, here's an example of a long lead item, we're trying to figure out what the design package deliverable date should be. We have a sense of what the required on-job date is going to be for that piece of equipment. So we've gone through and built this Fragnet off-site. You know, we've color-coded things. Green's design, orange is procurement, blue is construction or required on job. Build a bunch of those. Put them off to the side. Make sure the coding's right. Make sure your logic is right. And then all you have to do is copy-paste that Fragnet in. And again, people aren't watching you do the administrative stuff, and you're just providing value. So now the rubber hits the road here. So the nature of an IPS is to flush out ideas, right? And to further the development process. That very often takes you in a direction that, it's all good ideas, but takes you in a direction that's not core to your principle for that meeting. Stay to task, but keep track of those. You know, if someone brought it up, there's probably a reason and it needs to be further vetted. More often than not, we have 2 projectors running during all our planning sessions. One for the schedule, the second for notes and action items and drawings that are being put up. Actually, I'm going to jump to my last bullet here. Recommend the project controls team that's running this IPS, don't do it with 1 person. If you can afford to have 2 there, do that. You know, they're really doing 3 different things. They're developing a schedule, they're taking action notes, and they're also kind of document the overall process and where we need to go to. And then you've got 4th thing. You're actually, you need to be leading the meeting. You need to be thinking ahead of the group to bring them back on course if they go down a wormhole. So generally, if you have 2 people, that helps out in that process. So we talked about parking lots. 4 and 5, stakeholder involved in the process. Make sure the right people are in the room. Already in our experience, we've had great planning sessions. We're running forward with something, and then 2 months later, Joe sticks his head out from under a rock and says, wait a minute, what about me? This doesn't align at all with what I was thinking. So we've developed a communication plan. We know who the right stakeholders are now, and those people are at the table to make the right decisions. Okay, follow-up. So you've had a great meeting. People are agreeing with the terms, the dates, the processes, the interdependencies. You now want to document that and close the loop. Typically, our audience loves working with the NetPoint file, and we just pitch that right back out to them in an 11 by 17 or 8.5 by 11. Also, get back out those action items. Make sure everything is right, but then kick it out as quick as you can. And then the last step is integration with P6. So again, our master file, our program integrated master file, master schedule, is in P6, and we're using NetPoint development, NetPoint IPS to further that process. Each of these tools has distinct distinct benefits. Primavera is great for scheduling and execution and detail. NetPoint, which can also be great for detail, is a more collaborative, plan-based tool. You get a lot more involvement during the collaboration process. And as we transitioned, right now we are in, I'd say, basic design, working towards our design development. We have a CM that just got onboarded in the last couple weeks. And PMA has been involved for the last year. So during that last year, we were taking the schedule through early development, schematic design development, starting from 0 and moving towards a NetPoint file that had about 500 to 800 activities. It was at that point that we rolled it into Primavera to allow for more detailed planning and to allow for, this will be an integrated schedule, so we'll have XCRs from the designer and the CM and the validation company all working in harmony together. But what we found was that we wanted to keep doing IPS sessions in NetPoint. The audience liked the tool. It was a very efficient effort for us. And now we were determining, now we have a great work product in NetPoint, and we have a great work product in P6, and what do we do now? What's the next step? So we'll hold these subject IPS sessions talking about, all right, let's detail out the Building 2 design, or the early packages for Building 2, or a suite build-out, or whatever it is. Sometimes those IPS sessions would turn into a detailed work plan, and they would never make it into P6 because we don't need that level of detail there, right? Here you go, Joe, project manager. Here's your work for the next 3 weeks. You guys work on that. But more often than not, it's schedule that we did want back in P6. So the next few minutes, we're going to talk about efficient ways to do that. 2 ways to get information from NetPoint back into P6. There's a manual process and an automated process. And we're probably a 50-50 balance here, where we'll get those smart people in the room, do a planning session, and we may talk for 2 hours, but then you look at the NetPoint file, and we've got 4 or 5 activities. And it was more about thinking out the process, thinking about the interdependencies. And it was all valuable time. It's just we didn't get a lot of scheduled content out of the effort. And that's okay. We made a lot of progress. For small instances like that, we would just go into P6, add the activities, and call it a day. But when those IPS sessions really develop some volume, 30, 40, 50, 60 activities, no one wants to be recreating that information. So that's our focus for the next few minutes here. Obviously, when we started our effort, we started at NetPoint, and we've rolled everything into P6. That first transition was a difficult one. Took a lot of recoding, took a lot of effort and information. We'll talk about some of the headaches we ran into when we did that. However, now that we have a P6 standard, and that's going to be our master schedule, we have defined the work breakdown we want. We have defined the activity codes that we want. And certainly we're still adding to them. Nothing is locked down yet. We're in year 1 of a 4 or 5 year job. But we have a core set of dictionary items in P6. How P6 and NetPoint interact are through, I think NetPoint calls them source IDs. Another term we've heard is a database key. And that is the numerical code that's assigned in the database to a WBS item, a WBS dictionary item, an activity code dictionary item. there's a numerical number associated with those things. And those go back and forth through the XCR or XML files. So if you want to have a smooth transition from NetPoint back into P6, our recommendation is start in P6 with the information you want, right? So if you're going to have your NetPoint file have some WBS intelligence in there, use the WBS intelligence that you have developed in P6. So start with an export. Start with an export of an XCR. Okay, and that really what we're talking about here is WBS codes and resources. So what comes over? Everything that's assigned at the project level will come from P6 with that XCR file. If the code is associated at the global level, it only comes if it's assigned to an activity in that project, right? So if you have something in the global level and it's not associated with that project, it won't come when you do a project export. And again, what is this helping us with? It's really avoiding duplication of activities. You know, if you have a responsibility code in P6 called JoePM and you don't export that over and you recreate it in NetPoint and you call it JoePM and you put it back in, now you've got two JoePMs that aren't the same individual, right? So you have to do cleanup back in P6. And as I was talking to a few guys last night, the objective of our efforts here is not to increase administrative effort, it's to get a better product allowing us to do more intelligence and analysis. Not to create more administrative headaches. So hopefully some of these tricks we'll give you in the next few minutes here will help. What we've started doing is just out of default, take the current code structure, take the current information from P6 and export it out, and then start your NetPoint file from there, right? If you have a handful of activities that are level 2 and you want to turn those level 2 into a level 3, 4, or 5, use that export and start building off of those. Build your NetPoint plan. And then last thing, import that XCR back to P6 and tie up the loose ends. So let's talk about some of the best practices here. So we've broken the best practices down into management of information and management of dates. So on the information side, we want to start with the P6 database keys, right? We get that through an export. We're going to talk about clearly defining some activities, how we assign codes in WBS. And then on the managed date side, it's mostly about calendars and plan dates. And we'll spend a few minutes on each of these. Going back about 8 months ago, where we developed our 800 activity schedule in NetPoint, we utilized the spatial intelligence of NetPoint to say activities over here in this area are building 1 activities, and stuff over here is building 2, and these are all kind of validation things over here, and it worked great in NetPoint. You know, so we ended up with an activity structure that looked like something at the top. So first activity, we called it building 1 design. And then we got kind of lazy, and we called the second activity procurement. It was procurement for building 1, but we didn't call it that, and we didn't code it like that, right? And then construction. Well, we took this and we put it into P6, and guess what happened? Total disaster, yeah, to put it politely. So we have 6 buildings. We've got procuring hundreds of pieces of equipment. So we had 50 activities called procurement, not coded correctly. So what did we have to do? We started thinking, all right, well, let's just follow the logic chain back. All right, this was a procurement for building 1. That took way too long. So we just went back to NetPoint and we relabeled all the descriptions. So lesson learned, do it right the first time. And do it right means either better descriptions or better coding. You know, and if you're pulling something from P6 and you can start with that code structure, stick with it, right? So this would be a better solution. Building 1 design, building 1 procurement, building 1 construction. So as talked about just recently, incorporation of WBS, which was just this most recent iteration of NetPoint, allows you to use the WBS that you've created in P6 to better organize your NetPoint file. You don't necessarily have to show it using the WBS code structure. You can still kind of go by whatever you want, whatever the feel is of your NetPoint file, but that does exist. And this is the code manager, the WBS Code Manager, and works in a similar fashion as activity codes would. You have a list of your activities, and you assign them to whatever your WBS is. So now the tricky part, right? As every great CPM scheduler in the room knows, you don't want to overwhelm your schedule with constraints. However, a good NetPoint file utilizes planned dates when it can. So you're stuck in this kind of best practice yet getting the best schedule conundrum. You don't want to lose the benefit of a planned date. A planned date is really what I find is gets your community of users to support your schedule. And it's a more accurate plan. But you have to be careful and really deliberate when making that transfer from a plan date to a P6 CPM file. So there's a couple different options you can do. You could use lags, you could use plan dates, you could use preferential logic. What we're going to show here is the use of setting constraints, selective constraints, utilizing the drift buffer. So just as a definition, a drift buffer is the amount of time and activity, I'm going to say this twice, the amount of time an activity can gain before advancing the finish of the predecessor. So if you've taken an activity, I'm going to look this way, and you move it to a planned date, right, and you've got some gap before the predecessor activity, how far can you move this back before you start influencing the predecessor? All right, that's drift buffer. So if you use the search filtering mechanism, you can say, show me activities, milestones, whatever it is, delays, hammocks, that have a drift buffer greater than 0. Add those to my list, and now you've got a highlighted list of all the activities that have drift buffer. Typically what we do is we make a conscious decision. Was this a real benefit to having a planned date here? And more often than not, there is a reason why it's on a planned date if we've gone through a planning session for it. So that we then go through and set no earlier than constraints using the planned date. And make sure you check both of these boxes because you're setting a constraint and that constraint is equal to the planned date. The nice thing is you can kind of do that globally. So that kind of locks them in. One other thing that you want to check for before you transition things over is resolving any open ends. Works great in planning sessions for NetPoint because you can just fly. You can be adding activities on the canvas and they stick there, right? One of the downsides is when they stick there, you may have open ends without thinking about it. So we couple tricks and tricks we use is I like to go between the CPM and GPM view. And if your activities are bouncing around on you, it means that either you've got planned dates or you've got nothing's tied off. Another way to do it is through using the edit search feature that we just showed, but filter for open ends. Just to be clear, we showed this yesterday, but when you click no preds and no successors, that's an and scenario. So you should probably run it singularly. Show no preds, and then go to no successors, and look at both of those items. Because if you show both of these, you're only looking at ones that are totally open-ended back and forth. Another way to do it now is with the Schedule IQ metric. So this was demonstrated yesterday, where you can highlight on the list of activities, and on the canvas it will jump right to those ones so you can more quickly tie them off. You may have intentional open ends in your NetPoint file, and the reason you have that is because you plan on tying it back into P6 somewhere. So a real simple thing, what we've done is in the description, we've just put in a keyword, touch point, or something like, tie to P6. Remember, this is where we tie in. So once we pull it back into P6, we do a search for this term, get the list of those activities. Potentially, an even better solution is put the activity ID in at this point, or some description so oh yeah, that's what I was thinking. This is kind of going to tie to validation of this room. So now you should have a NetPoint file that is nice and coherent and ready for export and then import back into P6. So the last two slides here are just about that process. So if you export the file, if you came from a P6 file, some of this stuff will pre-populate. It'll give you the version and the name that it was. It will come with the calendars, codes, and resources that you've assigned into it. And then you create your XER file. A couple notes on calendars. I can't remember if I discussed this or not. Calendars will come in as a new calendar. So let's say, for an example, in your original P6 file, you have a calendar called Calendar 1 5-day. You export that data out into NetPoint, and you play around with it in NetPoint. The calendar would still be Calendar 1 5-day, but when you stick it back into P6, it's going to give it a new name. Because it won't overwrite, it's going to call it Calendar 1 5-day-1 or something similar. So how do you overcome that? Once it's back into P6, filter down for those Calendar 1 5-day-1s, find all those and do a fill and replace to tie it back into your correct calendars. And again, this is where if you're looking to match your schedule, right? If you already have a P6 schedule that you're refining and building upon, let's say you exported an activity chain that had, in P6, you had activity A and B. You export that out to NetPoint, and now your schedule contains A, B, C, D, and E. If you, during your import settings, up under here, import action, if you match the file that's there and tell it what file to go back into, it's going to update A and B, but also add C, D, and E.
So hopefully this has given you some insight. I hope there's some questions, and I hope some of the people in the back can help me on some of them. I think we're beginning to find an efficient manner that helps us get further schedule information through IPS sessions. The use of NetPoint is super beneficial to it. I think it gets us a much better product. And then some of the processes and tricks here help us coordinate and roll back into P6 more efficiently.